Welcome to episode number 35 of Cilium Weekly, a weekly show where I explore a new Cilium feature. And in this episode, I'm going to talk about IPv6 and Kubernetes. And we see a clear shift in users building IPv6 only clusters, and really to get the scalability of IP addresses in your Kubernetes cluster so that you don't run out of IP like you may sometimes do when using IPv4. But when using IPv6 cluster, you need to think about how you're going to connect with the outside world, right? Which may still be running on IPv4. So you have to think about two different things, right? You have to enable access from your IPv4 workloads into your IPv6 based cluster. And you have to do the other way around, where you have your IPv6 cluster and you have your pods running in your cluster, and they want to access some data running on IPv4, right? So we need to enable some kind of translation between the IPv4 world and the IPv6 world in both directions. And for this, we're going to need some kind of gateway that can do the translation, right? And Cilium can actually act as a gateway. And before I joined Isovenant, I tended to think of Cilium as just a kind of container network interface, but can also be deployed as a kind of a standalone appliance and be a gateway, like a NAT gateway. So typically NAT is used for, NAT is network address translation, and it's typically used to translate from a IPv4 private IP address to a, IPv4 public IP address, for example. But here we're going to talk about NAT46 and NAT64. NAT46 is to translate from an IPv4 address to an IPv6 address, and NAT64 is to translate from an IPv6 address to an IPv4 address. And Cilium supports both models and can be that gateway between the IPv6 world and the IPv4 world. Now, last year there was a KubeCon session by Nikolai and Daniel, which covered this use case, and I'll help with the session just creating a couple of demos, and I'll show you some of the demos shortly. But we're going to be reviewing NAT46 and NAT64 in the rest of this video. First, let's have a look at the NAT46 use case, where you've got a workload on the left-hand side, which is running on IPv4, a client that is trying to access a service hosted in an IPv6 only Kubernetes cluster. So what we can do here is just deploy a NAT46 gateway, which will have a leg in the IPv4 world and one leg in the IPv6 world. So when after a DNS query, the external client will make a request to the public IPv4 address, for example, and that address will be translated into an IPv6 address and then will be forwarded on to the cluster. Again, that Cilium gateway is providing you with the NAT46 functionality. So what I've got here in the demo is a server set up and deployed in IPv6, and I've deployed Cilium as a NAT46 gateway and set up a translation from IPv4 into IPv6, so that when you try to access the 172.31.254.78 IP, it will be translated to the IPv6 address, and the curl is able to take me to the IPv6 only page. That was NAT46. NAT64 presents a different challenge, and that's really when you want to connect your IPv6 pods to a workload running on IPv4. The challenge here is the DNS resolutions, right? So if you have, a website like GitHub that is not on IPv6, you need to get an IPv6 address for the client, right? So we need to find a way to create an IPv6 address for github.com for our client to access it. So for this, we're going to be using DNS64. So if I do an NS lookup to github.com, I get the IPv4 address 142.82.121.3. Now, if I do an NS lookup, looking for quadruple A records, so for IPv6 address for github.com, I get nothing because again, github.com is not on IPv6. So what we need to be able to do is to create an IPv6 address for github.com. And for this, we're going to use NAT64. And NAT64 is just, a way for us to artificially create an IPv6 address. And we're going to be using the GCP, the Google DNS64 servers, which can be located here. And what this will do is this will append the IPv4 address, which is this. So if you recall before, the 140.82.121.3, that's this in hexadecimal, right? So we've kind of converted that IPv4 address and embedded it into this IPv6 address, and we've just added this to a well-known IPv6 prefix, which is this one here. Now, what this enables us to do is just again to have created an IPv6 address for our IPv6 client to connect to, and that's kind of a key part of the NAT64. It's often you need to have the DNS64 to go with it. DNS64 is the key part of it, but again, you also need the gateway to do the translation for you. And again, that's something that Cilium can do, and it can essentially translate from your IPv6 cluster into an IPv4 workload. And help you transition from the IPv4 world and to the IPv6. So that's all for today. Thanks very much for watching. I will see you in the next one.